Hello, good morning students. Today we'll start with female genital organ, that is the uterus. The uterus is a piriform hollow muscular organ of the female genital tract containing within the pelvic cavity and is situated in between the urinary bladder in front and the rectum behind. It communicates with the vagina in front and with the general peritoneal cavity by uterine tube which opens at its lateral angle. Measurement and weight of the uterus, in that the body and fundus measures about 5 centimeter or 2 inches. Cervix part of the uterus measures 2.5 centimeter or 1 inch. Uterine cavity and cervical canal 6 centimeters or 2.5 inches, and uterus weighs about 28 to 38 grams in weight. Different parts of the uterus for the examination. The uterus consists of the fundus, a body, and the cervix. The fundus of the uterus forms the upper expanded portion of the uterus and lies above a line joining the two uterine tubes. The body of the uterus gradually diminishes in size from the fundus to a constriction below known as the isthmus, which corresponds internally to the internal os. The cervix uteri extends from the level of internal os to the external os and is divisible into supravaginal and vaginal portions by the attachment of vagina. The fundus of the uterus lies above the line joining the two uterine tubes. It is convex in all directions and is continuous with the anterior and posterior surfaces. It is completely covered by the peritoneum and is related with some coils of the small intestine. The next part of the uterus is the body of the uterus. The body is continuous above with the fundus and below with the cervix part of the uterus. At the level of the internal os, which is a constriction at the junction of the body and the cervix, and corresponds to the internal os internally. It gradually tapers towards the cervix. It consists of vesicle or anterior surface and intestinal or posterior surface. It is having two borders, right lateral border and left lateral border. The surfaces of the body of the uterus. In that, first is the vesicle or anterior surface. This vesicle or anterior surface is a flat and is directed downwards and forwards. It lies in contact with the urinary bladder, which lies below and in front of this vesicle or anterior surface of the body of the uterus. It is covered by the peritoneum as far as the level of the internal os, from where it is reflected onto the superior surface of the urinary bladder, forming the uterovesical fold, and the excavation between them, that is in between the bladder and uterus, is known as the vesico-uterine pouch. Next is intestinal or posterior surface. This intestinal or posterior surface is convex and is directed upwards and backwards. It is covered by the peritoneum. Traced downwards and backwards, the peritoneum is seen to cover the supravaginal portion of the cervix uteri and the upper part of the posterior wall of the vagina, and then it reflected to the rectum, forming the recto-uterine fold. The peritoneal excavation in this situation between the uterus and the rectum is known as the recto-uterine pouch, or it is also known as the pouch of Douglas. The intestinal surface of the uterus is related to the rectum, sigmoid colon, and some coils of the small intestine. Diagram is the sagittal section of the pelvic cavity. Here in this diagram we can see the all three organs, that is the urinary bladder, the uterus and vaginal cavity, and the rectum and anus. Here we can see that uterus is been placed in between the bladder and rectum, and so this part or this surface of the uterus is a anterior surface and this surface is a posterior surface. This anterior surface, as we can see, it is facing anteriorly as well as to the inferior, and in between the anterior surface of the uterus or anterior surface of the body of the uterus and urinary bladder, we have a peritoneal fold. as this is present in between the uterus and the bladder also known as vesicle. So in between the uterus and bladder this pouch is present, so it is called as utero-vesical pouch or vesico-uterine pouch. Then at posterior surface, as we can see, this surface is facing posteriorly as well as it is facing superiorly or upwards, and in between this posterior surface and the rectum part we have one more peritoneal fold which will be reaching to the cervix as well as vaginal part of the cervix downwards. This pouch is called as recto-uterine pouch as it is present in between the rectum and the uterus. This pouch is also called as pouch of Douglas by a anatomist or obstetrician James Douglas. This pouch is named. This is important according to the pathology also, where the ascitic fluid will be collected, or any fluid which collects in the abdomen also collects in this pouch of Douglas and may cause the problem. Next is margins or borders of the body of the uterus. The lateral margin of the uterus is convex and gives attachment to the broad ligament which stretches laterally to the pelvic wall. It is related to the uterine vessels which lie in between the two layers of the broad ligament. The uterine tubes pierces the uterus at the upper end of each lateral margin. Lying below and in front of the tube is the round ligament of the uterus, and below and behind is the ligament of the ovary. Today we have started with the uterus, its introduction and the gross anatomy. We have started with the fundus, its gross anatomy and relation, the body part of the uterus, its gross anatomy with its surfaces, borders and their relation. In next class we'll go further and see the other remaining parts. Thank you.